what is Project Success? Project Success is a resource center that supports higher academic achievement for students with disabilities. We are building local capacity to ensure that students with significant cognitive disabilities achieve increasingly higher academic outcomes and leave high school ready for post-secondary options. Project Success is part of the Indiana Resource Network and strives to support teams of teachers and administrators throughout Indiana as they work to implement academic standards into their daily instruction for students with significant disabilities. Indiana Standards Tool for Alternate Reporting, or ISTAR, is the alternate assessment. The alternate assessments need to be based on the same foundation of rigorous real-world content included in iStep Plus, while taking into account the unique characteristics of students with significant cognitive disabilities. Federal law and state law require that all students participate in Indiana's assessment system. For most students with special needs, this law requires participation in iStep Plus assessments, with or without accommodations. For students with significant cognitive disabilities, however, the Case Conference Committee may determine that iStar is the most appropriate assessment. Details about the iStar assessment. The iStar assessment is an online assessment. Students respond using their mode of communication. Student achievement is based on academic knowledge. iStar is assessed in 3 windows: Part 1, Part 2, and Part 3. Accommodations are according to the student's IEP. Cut scores for each content area were set, and student achievement were based on 3 performance levels: Pass Plus, Pass, or Did Not Pass. Content connectors, or the alternate standards, guide what will be assessed on the iStar assessment. The first alternate assessment in Indiana was in 1998. In 2002, Indiana adopted iStar. iStar was based on functional standards. It was teacher-rated and growth-based. In 2014, Indiana adopted NCSEC for English Language Arts and Mathematics. It was based on alternate achievement standards known as core content connectors. It was based also on student response. Achievement was based on grade-level alternate achievement standards. In 2015, Indiana adopted iStar, or Indiana Standards Tool for Alternate Reporting, which was measured English Language Arts, Math, Social Studies, and Science. It was based on alternate achievement standards known as content connectors, and was assessed in 3 windows: fall, winter, and spring. The assessment has 3 tiers, or levels of complexity. It had student response, to include multiple choice online test platform. Achievement was based on grade level alternate academic standards. Let's take a moment to think about how the alternate assessment has transitioned. I want you to take a moment to compare and contrast the former iStar assessment prior to 2014, which is included in column 1, and the new iStar assessment, 2015 and beyond. I want you to compare how the iStar assessment prior to 2014 is similar and different from the iStar assessment of 2015 and beyond. I want you to think about both their differences and their similarities. Which grades and subjects have content connectors or alternate standards? English Language Arts is assessed in grades 3 through 8 and in grade 10, as is Mathematics, grades 3 through 8 and grade 10. Science is assessed in grades 4, 6, and grade 10, whereas Social Studies is assessed in grades 5 and grade 7. Alternate standards are also referred to as content connectors. These terms are used interchangeably. These were previously known as the core content connectors with the Nixon assessment. Content connectors highlight the necessary knowledge and skills within the Indiana state standards in order for students to reach the learning targets at each grade level. They are simplified from the Indiana state standards. Focus on the core content for each standard and within each subject: English Language Arts, Mathematics, Science, and Social Studies. Content connectors also highlight the knowledge and skills needed at each grade level. And lastly, they identify priorities in each content area to guide instructions of students with significant needs and for the iStar assessment. Alternate standards are also referred to as content connectors. These terms are used interchangeably. These were previously known as the core content connectors with the Nixon assessment. Content connectors highlight the necessary knowledge and skills within the Indiana state standards in order for students to reach the learning targets at each grade level. They are simplified from the Indiana state standards. Focus on the core content for each standard and within each subject: English Language Arts, Mathematics, Science, and Social Studies. Content connectors also highlight the knowledge and skills needed at each grade level. And lastly, they identify priorities in each content area to guide instructions of students with significant needs and for the iStar assessment. As you remember, the iStar assessment is assessed in 3 windows. Part 1, which is October through November. Part 2, which is January through February. And Part 3, which is assessed April through May. Prioritizing instruction is very important when you're working with the content connectors. It's important to realize that there are symbols and keys that will guide you on determining which content connector is the most priority. A critical content connector is identified as having a check plus behind it or beside it. This shows that the content connector will be assessed in Part 1, 2, and Part 3. Important standards are identified with a check mark. They are typically assessed in 2 parts of the assessment, typically Part 2 and Part 3. And additional standards, which can be assessed in the classroom, are symbolized as having a clipboard beside them. These are not assessed on the iStar assessment, but can or should be assessed within the classroom. For today's training, I've used a star symbol to highlight critical content connectors on our resources. So look for the star as we proceed. This is an example of mathematics content connectors. As you see in the far right-hand corner, the star symbolizes critical content connectors. In the left-hand column, you have Indiana academic standards. These are the standards for students who take the I-STEP assessment. In the middle column, you have the content connectors, standards for students who take the I-STAR assessment. The content connectors are based on the Indiana standards and are simplified for students with significant disability. In the right-hand column, you have the testing window for the I-STAR assessment, telling you exactly which content connector will be assessed and which window you will see it on the assessment. If you look at number sense 3NS1, you see the Indiana Academic Standard, the content connector, read, demonstrate, and write whole numbers up to 200. And then you see that this content connector is assessed in Part 1, Part 2, and Part 3, making it a critical content connector. It is assessed in all three windows. Now let's take a moment and look at the similarities and differences between the Indiana academic standards and the content connectors. In the left-hand column, we have the Indiana academic standard for grade 3 mathematics, number sense, 3NS1. In the center column, we have the content connector for the same standard. And in the right, we have the windows that this standard will be assessed on the I-STAR assessment. Please take a moment to read the Indiana Academic Standard, the content connector, and look at the similarities and differences between the two. Here is another example of critical content connectors. I bring your attention to the right-hand column, where you will see 3 critical content connectors, which are assessed in Part 1, Part 2, and Part 3 of the I-STAR assessment. In the final column, under computation, you will see 3C2, which is assessed in Part 2 and Part 3 of the I-STAR assessment. Although it is not a critical content connector, it is very important, as you see that it is assessed in Part 2 and Part 3 of the assessment. The posters align the content connectors grades 3 through 10. They are aligned by grade level and strand. Once again, you're going to see that the content connectors are prioritized, with Part 1, Part 2, and Part 3 symbolizing which part of the assessment that you will see the content connector. Using the posters, take a look across the grade levels to determine how the standard progresses within a subject and strand between grades 3 through 10. Here is a closer look at a mathematic, algebraic, thinking, and functioning poster. You see grades 3, 4, and 5, and 6 aligned. You see the star symbolizes critical content connectors. In grade 3, we have a check plus, making it critical. In grade 4, we have a check plus, making it critical. And in grade 5, we have a check plus, making it critical. This is important because you will be able to look and see which content connectors align and at which grade levels are they the most critical and important. This standard across between grades 3, 4, 5, and 6 is critical, and then in grade 6 it is important, making this a priority standard.